Greetings, I'm Herbert Erpaderp, and today, in the what I'm calling the Will It Float series, I'm going to build this 35th scale Type 166 Schwimmwagen, try saying that 5 times quickly, from Italeri. Being a, I believe, 1977 tooling, this is a much older kit than the previous Schwimmwagen I built, also a completely different kind of Schwimmwagen. But as I alluded to before, I will be very scientifically testing if this does or does not float. Comment below if you think it's going to sink or not. Don't cheat by skipping ahead either. Or do, I'm not your dad. Inside the box there's a couple of sprues with all of the bits you'll need to build a Schwimmwagen. Also a bicycle. I'd just assumed the bike on the box art was part of the art. It looks pretty decent, as do most of the other parts, especially considering the age of the tooling. That said, there is a bit of flash and some mold lines. None of it's really anything horrendous, but some of it is a bit annoying, particularly on the smaller parts, and all that really means is you'll just have to do a little bit of cleanup. There are definitely worse things. You may notice that there are not 1, not 2, but 3 figures in this kit. It's not only the bicycle from the box art that's included. It seems maybe this kit was intended to make a little diorama, perhaps of a Schwimmwagen driver showing off his floaty car to a man, woman, and bicycle. The figures do actually look pretty decent. The kit came with 2 sets of clear parts, which makes sense considering how much bending you need to apply to get the windshield into place. Either that or it's a simple mistake. It could be either. There's a set of decals included, and they're clearly labelled for this kit. As far as decals go, they look pretty decent. I can't see any problems with them. The instruction sheet is the fold-out kind that I'm not really the biggest fan of, but because this is a fairly simple kit with fairly simple instructions, there's only a couple of pages, so this doesn't get too unruly on the workbench. The instructions themselves are pretty reasonable. There was a couple of instances where it isn't 100% clear where they want parts to be attached, especially those without keying, but overall they're good and easy to understand and follow. Let us now commence the gluing together of bits of plastic. The first thing to do is glue the little dashboard parts into the underside of the hull top. Right next to that goes this bracket for the steering column. It's not the most difficult thing to do, just make sure that you put the parts around the right way. Otherwise your driver is going to have a bad time, and he might make you have a bad time. There's also a little handle that goes on the passenger side. There isn't really any keying for it, so I just put it where it looked like it should be. In hindsight, it might possibly be a little bit too far to the right. Oh well. Next, it's time to glue the lower hull together. For whatever reason, this is made up of 2 parts. They do go together fairly well, though I wouldn't call it perfect, and I feel like this might prevent the Schwimmwagen from schwimming. So that the hull doesn't come apart as soon as any pressure is applied, I leave it to bond for a bit. Then it's time to attach the upper hull, and after test fitting, I determined that it would be best to glue this on in sections. I felt like the front would be the most visually important bit, so I did that first. I held the part to make sure that it stayed where I wanted it, and when it was bonded, I glued the rear section together. This needed pressure and nudging to get it to line up, which is why the front part needs to be nice and firmly in place. If it isn't, it'll just shift out of place when you apply pressure. This is definitely not perfect, but it is together. Now it's time for some internal detail. I glue the front seats into the floor bit, which is pretty simple. This next part, whatever it is, should probably have gone in first. I had to kajigger it into place under the seat. Not the most difficult thing ever, but it would have been easier to do it the other way. Then, in a stroke of brilliance, I knocked my glue over. The little gear stick, whatever it is, got soaked in glue, so it is a bit damaged, but I got it into place anyway. I followed that with the other, slightly larger gear doodad. It's not overly complicated, but it is better than no internal detail. None of the figures are seated, so unless you've got something in your bits box, or you're willing to do some pretty major surgery, you don't need to worry about putting figures in here. Not that I was going to do that anyway, but you can't, because they don't fit. The interior does fit though, so I put that into the hull. You could just drop it in there, and it would probably be right, but I applied some pressure just to make sure that it was sitting correctly. Next, I glue this shield thing on top of the muffler. The guide pins do a pretty good job of guiding this. This bar goes into place next, and there's a couple of raised guides here to make sure you don't put this on all wibbly wobbly. I then add this thing, which is a mount for the MG. I chose not to add the weapon, mostly because I didn't feel like cleaning it up. I'm not sure if they left unoccupied mounts like that, but that's how I've left it, so that's how it is. A spare wheel goes on the front here, nice and easy. Just behind the spare wheel, on either side, I add a pair of doodads. I've no idea what they are.
Oh, big surprise there, Herbert.
They are simple enough to install, whatever they are. The muffler can then be installed here toward the rear. There's a bunch of holes here, but only 2 of them are for the muffler. Headlamps are then installed at the front. There are of course clear parts for these, but it makes sense to omit these until it's time for painting. The little clock on the wall tells me that now is the optimal time for suspension. This is really simple. You get 1 part for the rear, and 1 slightly less strong feeling part for the front. The front part did need a little bit more pressure than the rear, and to avoid breaking it, I used my knife. Applying pressure to the outside would have probably broken the thin bit. Now that we've got suspension, why not wheels? These did require a small amount of assembly. This little ring part goes inside the back part of the wheel. The openings in these parts aren't exactly the same size, so I nudged it until the smaller opening was in the centre of the larger one. Then it's a simple matter of gluing the back part of the wheel into the front part. It would be really silly to stop there, so I install the wheels. They're all the same, so no need to worry about particular wheels being put in specific places. On the rear left, I add this number plate thingy. There's no keying for it, nor for a lot of the upcoming details, so you've just got to kind of eyeball it. One of the easier, more obvious ones is the steering column. It goes in through the bracket and down into a little recess in the floor part. Might as well put the steering wheel on next. You probably don't want this tilted at some crazy angle, so you may have to nudge it a bit until it looks right. On top of the muffler, I install this tool. I've no idea what it is. It's probably sauerkraut related. What else could it be? I then put the front bumper into place on the front.
As opposed to the front bumper that goes on the rear?
Yes. I wasn't quite sure if I was putting this on the right way up. It is kind of hard to tell in the instructions. I don't know if it even matters though. It could do with a bit of putty work where it joins the hull, but that's for future Herbert to worry about. Just below that, a hook. It seems like this is meant to swivel. Even though it didn't really want to sit straight, I chose to model it in the centre. It is a bit rough looking, but we could cover it in mud, I guess. Rear seats, or if you want to be technical, rear butt palaces, come next. And I was kind of hoping they would help hide the rather large gap in the sides of the hull. The part does fit well enough, it's just that it doesn't and shouldn't cover the gaps. That's probably another bit of putty work for future Herbert to do. At the front left, a no-tech light, and this pretty much drops right into place. I add the oar next, and as I mentioned before, there's no keying for this. I used the box art as a reference, and it looks like the wide end of the oar should be sitting in the bracket of the license plate holder, so that's where I put it. Below and in front of that, I put the shovel. This doesn't quite seem to fit the shape of the hull, but I glued it in place as best I could. Then I install this bar. I don't know the technical term for it, but I assume it's very important, and it goes roughly here. Again, you've just got to kind of eyeball it. There's one of these for either side. The side mirror, or something that looks like a side mirror, goes on here. It seems like it's meant to stand by itself, slightly near the hinge point of the windshield. I did check to see if there was drilling instructions that I may have missed, but there weren't. I just glued it up against the hinge part so that it would have some strength and not just fall over. Below and slightly forward of that, I add this, I think it's a horn or siren or something. Again, its position is eyeballed, and I use the box art as a reference because the instructions only really have a vague arrow pointing in the area this should go. Onto the rear, I add the propeller mounting plate thing, whatever you want to call that. There's a nice guide slot for this, so it's pretty simple. I then add the main body of the propeller thing. I figured it made more sense to put this on now, because once the other bits of detail are glued to it, it'll be a lot easier to cause damage. The propeller pretty much drops right into place, though you will probably have to nudge it so that it's straight. It makes more sense to add the little cowling thing above that and then nudge them both at the same time so they're all nice and together. Then we get to choose if we want the propeller up or down. I chose up. There's some latch detail on the hull and propeller cover thing, and you just line those up. I did have to hold it for a little bit because there's enough tension in the propeller assembly that it wants to spring up and off the hull, but that's not a big deal. I follow that with a hook on either side of the hull. Again, you have to eyeball these a bit, but they do mount onto some raised bits, so it's pretty easy to see where they should go. On the right rear of the hull, I add this little handle. Presumably this is for hanging on while the Schwimmwagen drives around. Boats around? It's definitely for silly water activities. I then installed the windshield part. You can't see it too well, but I had to bend this quite a lot to get it to clip into the mounts on the hull top. It didn't break, but it felt like it might. The only problem I have is that it doesn't quite look like what the box art shows. There's also a clear plastic window for the rear of the canvas cover too. It looks like this. You can model the canvas cover in the up or down position. My main reason for using the up version is that it should make it harder to see the gaps in the sides. They're not the worst gaps, and they are only really obvious if you can see something light coloured through the gap, like my fingers in this clip. And it does make sense to not glue the top part on before painting, so I didn't glue the part on. So now, the important question, will it float? Maybe I should play some suspenseful music here while we wait for the very scientific experiment to progress. This tripod shot was originally 3 minutes long. In that time, it doesn't seem like any water got in at all. It is conceivable that the floor part might be hiding some water, but I don't think so. I do suspect that if it was a little bit heavier it might sink, but I suppose this was a success. How many of you were correct in your guesses? How many of you skipped forwards and commented the correct answer? You cheaters. Anyway, now that the very important science has been done, the Italeri Type 166 Schwimmwagen in 35th scale is now completed, and I'm pretty happy with the result. It's probably not the best model of a Schwimmwagen out there. I mean, it is a pretty old tooling, but it's not awful, and it does actually schwim. Does it have to be powered to schwim? It floats. That's gotta be a bonus in somebody's books. It wasn't the most difficult kit to build, though the lack of keying or guides in some areas was a little bit annoying. Not too much of a hindrance to actually getting the thing built, just a little bit of an annoyance. All you've got to do is use your eyeballs and brain cell just a little bit. Some bits of flash and some of the mould lines were a little bit heavy, but again, considering the age of the tooling, it's actually quite good. According to ScaleMates, it's from 1977, which is 47 years ago. That's older than me. It wasn't very expensive either, so it's got that going for it too. There are bound to be other Schwimmwagens out there that have more accurate and better detail, but as someone who didn't spend 4 years at Schwimmwagen school, I couldn't tell you the ways in which this model is inaccurate. But it looks fine, and it's also kind of nice that it comes with a bicycle, which I didn't build. As I probably said though, or at least thought about it, it's almost like a mini diorama in a box. There will be more of this super serious, scientific Will It Float series. I'm sure that was a late night show segment from the 90s or something. It's mine now. If anyone has any suggestions for floaty vehicles, let me know. It can't all be Schwimmwagens. I do have a Ford GPA in my stash, but more ideas are welcome.
You're not taking modelling seriously enough, Herbert. Blah, 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 blah.
Oh no. Anyway, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to put them in the comment section below. If you'd like to watch me build kits like this one live, I do stream modelling a couple of times a week both here on YouTube and on Twitch. Twitch even has a schedule you can check out. There's a link in the description. Subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of thing, and if you really like what I do, consider supporting on Patreon or Ko-fi if you're able. Links to those are in the description too. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.